My name is Keith Grimes, and I am a doctor. I'm a general practitioner. I've been a doctor for 28 years and a GP for 24 of them. But my passion is technology. And when I was working mostly in the NHS, I was involved in a lot of technology projects there. And then around about the mid 2010s, I pivoted more into industry. And there I've been working with health tech companies like Babylon. And now I run my own boutique innovation consultancy offering fractional chief medical, product, and clinical safety officer services to health tech companies. Issue of gender bias and bias against even other minority groups has been present in healthcare for a long, long time, and some of the reasons for that have been well discussed. But if we just try and focus on technology, and in particular artificial intelligence, it has been present principally because artificial intelligence is very dependent on data. And the data that we use to train AI models comes from medical research and the information that's out there. And as we know, that hasn't been very well distributed to different groups. There's been certain groups that have been treated very preferentially and others that haven't. And if we're talking about gender, then sadly, women have not been on the good receiving end of this. So we start from a baseline of not having the right amount of information. Now, activity is being taken to correct that. But what is useful about AI is that an awareness of this, either through the research, but also through the application, has raised the profile up a little. So my experience thus far is that people are aware of it and talk about it a lot. But that doesn't mean that it's solved by any means, and we can talk a little bit more about that. The main issues that I've seen with it have first been where the data has been captured in a kind of naive way and then just transferred straight into a model. Bias emerges in three places, either from the source data, as it is the source data biased, or have people selecting the data to train the models in a way that emphasizes bias as well, because you have a choice about how that comes in. And then when you're training AI models, the models that you pick and how you train them can enforce bias. And so what you can sense from that is decisions made by the humans collecting the data or creating it, selecting it, and then choosing which ones to go into what model are all areas where human biases can be implemented as well. And what that then leads to is models behaving in a way that is undesirable for how we want to operate today. And in my experience as a doctor working in health tech, particularly in artificial intelligence, the most obvious example that I had is when I was working at Babylon and we had a symptom checker. And that symptom checker would allow people to report their symptoms. And then based on those symptoms, it would give them an indication of if there was an urgent problem and then what the cause might be. This was trained very carefully using epidemiologists on the available data. But we ran into some public anxiety when testing by some of the public found that when you reported chest pain, if you reported chest pain and you were saying that you were male or female, you were getting different answers. And those answers would be much more emphasizing the sort of physical causes like heart attacks in men. And whilst it was also mentioning it in women, it was actually changed in probabilities and some other issues were actually elevated up the way. And seeing it on the face of it, it seemed very obvious at that point that that didn't seem right. And what was interesting as we wrestled with this is that even though some of the decisions that we made in terms of building the model were correct, I think we were insufficiently concentrating on the fact that that data, even though it was the right data, might actually reflect bias in the data that was available. And so we learned from this, we made changes to the model, and we learned an awful lot about how you actually apply a model. Once you've built it, it's still how it's presented to people. What people understand AI should be doing is really important. So there's an element of building an understanding and trust in the people that are building it, in the healthcare system, and ultimately the wider population. It's always kind of two broad things relating to the people in this work. The first of which is that you want to make sure that the people that are involved are diverse, that you have diverse opinions brought in as well, because all of us, no matter how high our aspirations, will have some, unknown biases in there as well that lead to some blind spots, despite the efforts that you might take. And by having a mixed team across whatever diversity you want to look at, for a start, you're less likely to have these arise. And so, I mean, that's the first start. You want to make sure that you move towards that area. But then equally, you need to make sure that those people have an awareness of this issue and potentially have checks and balances in the steps that you're taking to make sure that you are bringing it to front of mind in the same way that you might look at issues of safety and regulation, security, privacy, making sure that it behaves appropriately for all the different groups and the populations that you serve is very important. So that's part one, is the people and these checklists. Second thing is making sure that you have people that are adequately trained or have an understanding of the different specialist areas in there. So you're going to want to have AI researchers that understand what models do and don't do. You're going to want to make sure that you get healthcare professionals and clinical scientists that understand the strengths and weaknesses of current practice and the data that's in there. And then people working on building the right models, designing an interface that works for people. But also in the groups, I'm inevitably going to miss some groups here, but also in the people who choose what problems to solve, because some problems might seem obvious to certain groups. And if you have an entrepreneurial group that has been selected just through society in general, tending to skew one way, let's say it tends to skew more towards the male, or if you're getting more funding towards males, you get this kind of shift towards addressing problems, important as they are, that are maybe going to be less helpful to other groups as well. And this is why it's so exciting to see the rise of femtech as a sort of force within this, because it helps very, very mindfully correct against that. And you see companies like Flow, for example, who recently, I think, became the first femtech unicorn, raising a valuation over $1 billion through a big funding round, concentrating very specifically on that area as well. Now, we don't want to just leave it to certain populations to have to correct these problems. We all have our work to do, but that's one way in which we try and do this. There's contributions everywhere. Sometimes you might not even think about them. Goes all the way back to education, really, doesn't it? It's the decisions that we make all the way back to the very start of schooling and education, and the expectations of what are proper subjects for people to study. And we've seen a lot of work done in encouraging women to go into STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and the like. And I would say that we need to continue to do this and start to look to see that we've got an appropriate balance coming in. And that's not just about affirmatively choosing and selecting and pushing people to those areas, but also making sure that those courses, as they become more undergraduate and postgraduate, help support groups that may have very particular life requirements. So we know that women in general tend to have greater caring responsibilities, just as the nature of our society, which means that if you have certain courses that don't account for that, or certain employment practices that don't account for that, it's going to disincentivize people to come into that area. And I think we're all sort of aware of that. But the other side of it just comes down to an acceptance of the real strength that comes from diversity of thought and opinion and experience and approaches too. The approaches that we take to how we build these technologies, historically will come from a certain perspective. And that means that other perspectives focusing on different areas may be reduced. And I think we need to try and correct that and accept that there are many different ways to solve the problems in front of us that may be more alien to certain groups, but more acceptable to others. So it's about balancing that. And that comes down to management and leadership in the organizations as well. It can feel sometimes that you're over-focusing on one group. We weren't focusing on anyone, but now we're focusing on this other group. Well, what you're doing is you're having to do so to correct for this historic significant imbalance as well. And so we have to recognize that people maybe feel that way and just help them understand why it might feel that way and the reasoning behind it. I think we're all finding our way through this, and as long as we're doing it in the right way and supporting people to make the change, I think that can be positive. So that's about the process of correcting, and then monitoring the diversity of your workforce and who's involved and so on, all the way down to hiring practices. People from diverse groups to come into clinical trials and research, and then from a health tech perspective, taking a focus on user-centered design and getting people to really involved in co-creation takes active effort. It will always take active effort, and it can be, one of the things that may happen is certain groups may be slightly more reluctant to participate in this work, and there's a host of different reasons for that in there. So we just first have to accept that there will be some challenges to do this, which is going to mean you're going to have to expend more effort to engage with groups. So the first thing we have to do is recognize that happens and persist, and not sort of fall at the first hurdle and say, well, these are a difficult group to engage with, I'm not going to. And that can be hard for companies in particular, because they have the pressure of trying to move forward at pace to satisfy the needs of their business and so on. So it takes care and attention and skill from, once again, those in leadership positions to sort of hold the line on that and balance all the pressures. When it comes to identifying and sort of engaging with different groups, having a diverse workforce really helps, because then you've actually got some people in your workforce that might be able to more easily engage with that group and translate, sometimes literally, sometimes in a softer way, the message in a way that's going to land a little bit better. And we know from our experience during COVID that there are certain groups that were very, very reluctant to engage, not with AI in this case, but with vaccination and so on. So you have to take different approaches. And again, this is not a specifically AI thing, but when working at Babylon and during COVID, we were working in the US, and there were certain groups in the community that were very reluctant to have vaccination. And the solution there was identifying community leaders and working with them who understand very well the issues within the community and can therefore act as a really good bridge and conduit, which means that the way that you approach the problem might actually differ from group A to group B to group C, or between male groups and female groups or whatever. So this is all about equity as opposed to equality, isn't it? You're not using exactly the same thing, you're just making the action effective. Recognize that it's not going to slow down. Number one, I mean, we're up against this. This is like a natural law almost about how fast AI moves. So what does that mean? Well, that means we all have to up our game. Nothing changes about what we have to do. We just have to be smarter and work harder on how we put this in place. But it's not just a matter of just trying to run faster. We have to think smarter as well. We have to think, is there anything that we can do about our processes? Can we make them a little bit more flexible or agile? Can we use AI to innovate in this space to actually help us engage with different groups as well? And so I think I would advocate that innovation, people often think about, we have a real world problem, we're going to use technology to solve that problem. And in doing that, problems arise to solve the problem. We should be using AI to innovate to solve those problems as well. And actually that can be just as, if not more, intellectually stimulating and exciting and interesting. And it's important that we kind of recast the challenge as not being a sort of pain that we just have to accept, but there's a genuine challenge that is important and important to resolve, but it's also very interesting to do as well. I spend a lot of time more on the clinical safety side, trying to people to think a little bit more that way, that this isn't just something that you have to do, like painful medicine that you have to swallow. This is part of what you have to do to get your idea out there. You have a responsibility to sort this out. So use some of that creativity and that forward thinking to fix those areas. I think that's maybe one way into it as well, spending some of that time to accelerate that bit. And that might come at the cost of some other areas. That's where you have to engage with the stakeholders a little bit, but it means that you get to a more equitable endpoint faster. And let's face it, you don't want to focus on a tiny group, you want to be focusing on everyone, so you have to consider everyone. One of the most interesting things that I found about AI across every aspect of what I do is that AI reflects what it's trained on. It's a little bit like a mirror, and when you hold up a mirror, you are then forced to look at yourself or ourselves. AI has really forced us to do this, particularly because there's an excitement about what AI might be able to do. But then you realize, well, this is where we are right now. I've got some challenges. I have to fix that. It gets us all to think much more deeply about what we do, what's important about what we do, what's wrong about what we do, and how we should address that. And I'll give you an example of that, is that there was a paper came out back in 2021 using machine learning and computer vision to identify the progress of arthritis in knees. And what that study showed is that the AI was very, very good at identifying the progression of disease, but also from the data that people from Black backgrounds were actually having the severity of their disease under-recognized when you used existing non-AI methods. In short, AI identified that the current state of practice was biased against a certain group. Now I'm talking about ethnicity and in this particular case, and there will be other examples with regards to gender. But what's been interesting about that is that adds more emphasis on the urgency for us to look at our existing practice and start to correct it. So it's led to AI actually helping us fix some of the problems that we had before, because it's surfacing it in a way that we can't get past. You can't just ignore it now. And so I like how AI forces us to really think about what we're doing again. And if this is like a great tool, I want to use it. Oh, there's this problem in the way. I have to fix this problem to use this tool. Well, if that forces us to change the problems, I kind of don't care why it's happening if we fix it. And I see that time and time again across different areas. Now, it's going to take time. The lovely other thing is that people hold AI to a higher standard than humans. And so that very fact means that it's kind of dragging the humans up. That's an interesting kind of, sort of unusual way of thinking about what it does. And then within that, there are other ways. So AI can sometimes demonstrate bias in its outcomes, but it does so in a kind of measurable way. And what that means is that you can then have a decision, like a medical decision, run it through the AI, know it will be biased in a certain way, but you can use that to flag scenarios that are more susceptible to bias within the human practitioner. So you can say, with this person in front of you, be extra careful, because in this situation, previous medical knowledge tended to emphasize some biases. So it can just force you to sort of slow and think again. I would say it lies in education. I mentioned earlier on, and then of course education is a very broad area. But if you could just say one area, I'd say, well, education, and in part it's about making sure that people are aware of bias and gender bias from the get-go, regardless. So they start with that particular area and other biases too. So they're well set to receive the rest of it. And then within each aspect, each of these different verticals that you've just described, to make sure that everyone understands about this, the existence of this, what contribution their particular specialism makes towards this, and what solutions might be within there as well. So people are aware of it, they can watch out for it, and they know how to fix it. I think that is probably the way to go. And it's not just about training the healthcare professionals and the people involved in the building of the AI, but it's also the wider public as well. So the wider public are aware of this, so they can be aware of what these tools can and can't do. And so they just don't always accept it at absolute face value, that they feel that they can recognize when things are going wrong, and then they can engage with the people that are manufacturing and running these technologies or deploying them and feedback and feel comfortable that things will be fixed. But it comes down to making sure that everyone involved in this understands how gender bias, or bias more widely, can manifest in their specialism or their area, how to reduce it, what to do about when you find it, how to prevent it happening. And I think in that way, we'll climb out of where we are to somewhere better. That's a tricky one, isn't it? Because there's a lot of things competing for mandatory status. If I talk about I want people to know about AI at medical school, for example, and digital health, but I've got all the other subjects in there as well. So I have to argue why one should be in there, what's going to give on the other side. Given that this is more than about AI and medicine, because it affects everything, I think we have a very, very good argument for saying that, yes, components of this absolutely should be mandatory. I suppose the other way around is like, why should it be optional not to consider the needs of everyone around you as opposed to one particular group? It then comes down to people in positions of leadership and the decision making to understand how they can negotiate this position and deal with some of the resistance that will come up. Some well-founded, some not well-founded. I think that's what it comes into. But I definitely, this falls into an area that while we implement it, will feel like people are over-focusing. We mentioned this earlier on, and with some of my more sort of more conservative, small c thinking people of the past, they couch this in terms that are used as terms of derision now. But we have to hold the line on this. And actually, I have a lot of optimism about this because subsequent generations are arriving with this actually. It's a non-negotiable. It's like, it doesn't make any sense that you wouldn't do this. So I think it's not a case of waiting it out, but hold the line, continue to push and make sure this remains in here. And then gradually those people who have the knowledge and the skills to start making sure that everything is in place will start to predominate and start to shift the balance back towards it. And we have to accept it's going to take some time. But as long as we're moving in the right direction and focusing on those priority areas, I think we'll do okay.
Thank you. Just two more questions. This is really good. What next for you when it comes to AI and potentially addressing gender bias in AI and machine learning systems?
Well, so it's a good question. I say, so I'm now thinking about, so in terms of addressing gender bias and AI machine learning and what I can do, like I said earlier on, AI is a mirror. It reflects, I have to think about this and then it's brought into my mind. So I have to keep it in my mind. So what is it that I do? I work with health tech. I have a position where I get to speak. I'm fortunate to have a bit of a voice and speak about this to make sure that I do address this and speak about this and speak out where I see something opposite, number one. Number two, in the services that I have agency in who I choose to work with and what problems I choose to work on as well. And so I have to make sure that I'm not, sometimes I may have to turn down some things to focus on other areas that may make less sense in terms of the bottom line, but actually helps to start correct what's happening in the background. So as a business owner and leader myself, I need to be able to make those decisions. I take care about who I work with in my own organization, and I have diversity as one of the principal values. So I have to make sure that I live this in check as well. If I get right back into what I can literally do, I spend a lot of time teaching people about generative AI and about how to understand it, but also how to use it, because AI is not just a tool that other people can use to build stuff. It's a tool that everyone can use to build things for themselves. And so I spend a lot of time teaching them to do that because I think that's the best way of developing solutions. How do I then address the gender bias? I make sure that I take that teaching and I give it to as diverse a group as possible and make sure that how I teach this lands in the right way, because I can't just tell it the way that I expect. I'm going to have to change that. So it means that I have to either hand over to someone else to do this teaching or take the feedback in that way too. So it's a really interesting question because, I'll admit I hadn't thought as deeply about how I would adjust things to do that, but it is in my control. And here I am talking about it. So yes, I have to go away and just think a bit more carefully about that. And then maybe make sure that I measure it. Because if I measure it, and I measure my progress, then I can't wriggle out of it the other line. Yeah, I think the biggest barrier, so personally, I probably sit in one of the least discriminated against groups. as it is. I am a white man from the Western world, and a number of other things as well. And I've trained well, so I'm in a fortunate position, both financially and professionally as well. So whatever I say and whatever I do, I always constantly have to remind myself that I'm doing myself so from a position of rather particular privilege as well. So how do I guide against that? I suppose it's just important that I continually at least check myself, but also surround myself with diversity of thought and opinion and remain open to this as well, and try and remain open when criticism arises, because I will make missteps. We all do. And I shouldn't let fear of that stop me learning from it or trying to make the right decision. I think that's the other thing that I find from my own perspective difficult, is it's difficult to talk about. I don't know if I've got the right language. I don't want to offend anyone in what I'm doing too, but I and any of us have to at least have some confidence, and then be kind to others if they do misstep as well. I think as long as we learn from those mistakes and move forward, then I think we're okay. So I think that would be the general lesson. And that's not just about AI, of course, but within AI, we've got a really interesting opportunity because there's a lot of excitement and interest. There's a lot of money coming into the area. Everyone's really keen to get the technology out there. So right now, everyone's like, but what's going to stop us? Now's the time. Now it's like, okay, well, this bit could stop us. So if we want to play with this great new thing, let's fix that. And again, however we get there, if we get to the right place, sounds good.
Dr. Keith, thank you so much for your enriching insights, thoughts, personal reflections and stories. We look forward to hearing more and seeing more from what you do. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing more about how I can help as be an ally in this one.